Welcome to Basic Brewing Radio for Thursday, August 30th, 2007. I'm James Spencer. Here at Basic Brewing Radio, we're all about home brewing. With this week, creating new beers by blending beers together. Matt Brynildson from Firestone Walker Brewing in Paso Robles, California, will join us to lead us through the process and also give us a look at his brewery's innovative barrel aging system. Well, if you're new to home brewing and would like to get into the hobby for the first time, check out our website, basicbrewing.com, where you can find archives of our audio and video podcasts and our DVDs to walk you through basic and more advanced brewing techniques. And speaking of the website, I've posted the second flash version of Basic Brewing video for those who are QuickTime challenged for whatever reason. This week we take a tour of Wynkoop Brewpub in Denver with Thomas Larson, the brewer who you heard on this podcast a few episodes ago. Just go to basicbrewingvideo.com to view it online. And, of course, I'm going to continue the MP4 version as well on the RSS feed as usual. And before I forget, I want to mention Oaktoberfest, which is sponsored by Firestone Walker Fine Ales. It's coming up on September 29th in Paso Robles, California. The event is a benefit for the hospice of San Luis Obispo County. At Oktoberfest, or Oaktoberfest rather, you'll be able to sample the special Firestone Walker Oktoberfest beer, available only at the event, along with German foods, live polka music, and Matt Brynildson in lederhosen, if the website is to be believed. So, mark your calendars for that, September 29th in Paso Robles, California. Thought that was appropriate to mention that as we're having Matt on the show this week. Taking a look in the mailbag, we had some good suggestions on brewing with coffee following our conversation on the topic last week with Chris Colby of Brew Your Own magazine. Brian from Whitby, Ontario, Canada writes, "Here's my idea for creating coffee beers. Take some of your existing home brews that you think might be nice with coffee and add freshly brewed coffee, a teaspoon at a time, until you find the mix of beer and coffee you like. Scale up and create your next beer with that amount of coffee in the secondary." I like that. Sounds nice and easy. Craig from Boston writes, "Thanks for the Brewing with Coffee show this week. It was right on time. I had been planning on brewing a coffee porter, still in the extract level," Craig says, "this weekend, and the show gave some insight into the process. I went with adding 20 ounces of brewed French roast at flame out. I didn't want the coffee to overpower the porter flavors, so I decided not to add it to the secondary as previously planned. We will see," Craig says. Well, good luck with that porter, Craig. I'm sure it'll be tasty. Let us know how it turns out. David from Olympia, Washington writes this, "Besides adding ground coffee or even standard brewed coffees to your boils and mash, there is one semi-obscure method that I think is overlooked for brewing coffee beers. This is the cold brewing method, or commonly known as toddy, which requires a fairly inexpensive cold coffee brewer. The cold coffee brewer I recommend is made by Filtron, and they have a home version for around $35. This method of brewing involves slowly dripping the specified amount of cold water over a specified amount of fairly coarsely ground coffee and letting it steep for up to 24 hours and filtering it into a carafe once the brew is finished. Cold-pressed coffee is much less bitter than regular brew methods and results in a smooth-tasting, low-acid coffee concentrate. From this concentrate, you can reconstitute it with hot water or even add milk or soy milk for a fast iced latte. Because of the low acidity and bitterness," David said, "I thought this method would be ideal for beer brewing. Adding this towards the end, the last few minutes of a boil, would most likely increase the toasty coffee flavors in this elixir, as well as allowing you to get more flavor with less liquid, as with espresso. Best of all, you won't overbrew your coffee, which is a surefire way to make your coffee bitter and will ruin great coffee every time." Spoken from a man up in a coffee country there. I appreciate that, David. Jack from Wynyard, Tasmania, in Australia. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. Australia. He adds one more scoop of coffee knowledge to the pot. Jack says, I was listening to your Brewing with Coffee show. I did a brew of a stout a while back and just added 1 dessert spoonful ground coffee to the fermenter just before the yeast, and it turned out wonderful with a lovely coffee aftertaste, not too overpowering. So there you go, steeping the grounds in the fermenter, which may be might kind of give you the same effect or a similar effect as the cold pressed coffee. I'm not sure. So excellent. There you go. As we said in the last episode, there are many ways to use coffee and beer, and I appreciate all the suggestions and feedback. John from Silverdale, Washington, writes with a tip about dealing with boilovers. John says, get a squirt bottle, fill it with water. As the boil comes up, squirt it down, and the foam will disappear. I've had the luck of brewing with 2 local microbreweries, and both used a hose to squirt down the boil-up. Well, that's a good one to try. Thanks, John. I've also seen a brewer at our local brew pub here in northwest Arkansas do the same thing with a hose, so I appreciate the reminder about that. John from Madison Heights, Michigan writes, my friend Eric and I are scouting the idea of buying a conical fermenter. I recently heard the podcast about those and got him interested in it. I told him to listen to the episode because it had a lot of information. If we did buy one, his question is, when do we add priming sugar, and if stirring the wort in the conical would disrupt the sediment? Well, it would be beer at that point. I know that there are some some brewers who are saying, that's not wort at that point, it's beer. And yeah, that's right. After fermentation, it would be beer. But other than that stickler point, I replied to John saying that I'm assuming that most conical owners keg their beer and don't do the bottling thing anymore, but I forwarded the question to my local conical go-to guy, Mark Smith, for an answer. And Mark wrote back, the few times I bottled the beer from the conical, Mark says, James is right, I mostly keg my beer. I always used a bottling bucket and added the priming sugar there. You don't want to add it to the conical because there will be yeast and sediment in the bottom of the conical even after dumping the trub at the end of primary fermentation. The secondary conditioning phase does allow for finishing of the beer and the yeast remaining in suspension after primary fermentation to drop out and settle in the bottom of the cone. So, stirring the beer would disrupt this sediment. Mark says the rotating racking arm, and that's inside the conical, allows you to get all the beer with very little sediment. So thanks, Mark. It sounds like if you're going to bottle using a conical, sounds like the same process, the same drill as if you were fermenting in a bucket or a carboy. So no shortcuts there. I appreciate all the email, everybody. I'm trying to set up a regimen where I can answer it in a timely manner in the morning, usually when I get my cup of coffee, so that seems to be working out pretty well. Be sure to double-check your email address if you use the online form so I can get back to you. Now, let's go on to our conversation with Matt Brynildson of Firestone Walker. Matt's one of the brewers at the forefront of the brewing scene nowadays. After hearing his presentation on blending at the National Homebrewers Conference in Denver, I wanted to talk to him one-on-one for the show. He's a very knowledgeable guy and makes some wonderful beers. Well, Matt Brynildson, welcome again to Basic Brewing Radio.
Thanks for having me.
The last time we talked, we were sitting on the porch in Orlando with John Mallett talking about hops.
Yes, indeed.
That was at an NHC, and I saw you again this year at the National Homebrewers Conference in Denver, and you were talking about blending.
Yeah, I feel really lucky to have been invited to speak for the homebrewers 2 years in a row. And so we tried to come up with something completely different. I've kind of been on tour talking about hops for a couple of years now. So we switched gears, and I was talking with Vinny from Russian River. He was doing a talk on sour beers and kind of his Belgian beer program that he works through his barrels. And so we thought it would be appropriate to talk about blending and some of the things that Firestone does with barrels.
Now, most people, I would imagine, when they think about blending, they don't think about beer, they think about wine.
Yeah, certainly. And I have to admit, that's from our perspective, I think we're more influenced when it comes to fermenting in barrels and our our program of aging beers in barrels, we're much more influenced by the wine industry than we are by Belgian beer brewing, to be honest with you. It seems like there's somewhat of a split in modern craft brewing. A lot of brewers are bringing barrels into their programs and using critters and using the barrel as a fermentation medium for secondary fermentation and flavor creation that way. And then there's the other camp of brewers who are using oak to impart flavors onto clean beers. So, what we were talking about at the homebrew conference was really kind of, looking at both sides of the coin there. Vinny talking about critter beers and how he's getting those flavors with his barrels, which, as a side note, for the most part are utilizing neutral barrels and then inoculating with these critters, whereas we're doing a lot with new American oak and also some activity with bourbon barrels and other barrels, then taking those products and blending them. And I think in the end, they're quite different products, but I walked away from the homebrew conference thinking really hard about maybe bringing some critters into our program somehow, because these sour beers, I think, really have a lot of potential in our blending program here in Paso Robles.
So your program is all about keeping the beer clean as far as not getting infections.
Yeah, to date, and a lot of that's my own hang-ups, I suppose. I'm a Siebel-trained brewer. I really adhere to the 101s or the classic brewing ideology, I guess, and so our entire program is all about clean beers.
And getting the flavors out of the barrels themselves and what may have been in the barrel before, right?
Right. So, Firestone got started 10 years ago fermenting beers in oak. And I think that the owners, Adam and David, were really thinking about their Chardonnay production back at the winery and how they were doing some primary fermentation in new American oak and really imparting some interesting characteristics to those wines. Now, wine is by no means a clean or critter-free operation, mind you. So when they started trying to ferment beer in oak barrels, they ended up with interesting, salad dressings at best. I don't think it was kind of a foul science experiment at first. So, they made a good decision. They hired a trained brewer, which wasn't me originally. It was a brewer by the name of Jeffers Richardson, who later on went on to brew at Sierra Nevada. But anyway, he really started studying what was going on in Burton-on-Trent, 100, 150 years ago with the Burton Union system, and really focused on that and realized that you can ferment clean beers in oak, and if you use new American oak, you can impart some really interesting flavors. I always talk about the fifth element. Brewing is all about, water, malt, hops, and yeast, and then here at Firestone we impart oak, and it really creates this new dimension in the products. Back to what we're talking about with blending, then it becomes kind of a natural part of the process. When you brew a beer, separate it into a whole bunch of barrels to ferment it, you inevitably need to bring everything back together, and then you have an opportunity to blend in at different levels this oak component. And that's kind of how it all started for Firestone anyway. So we really came at it from a completely different angle than most breweries. I mean, I believe, and I'm almost positive, we're the only brewery in the United States and still only one of two breweries that are still practicing this art/science of fermenting in barrels in the Burton Union format.
Yeah, talk about the Burton Union system. I've seen a video of your brewery, but for those who are not familiar with the process and who can't, they're driving in their cars on the way to work now. So, paint a picture for them of what your system is like.
Well, first I'll start with what's going on in the UK. At Marston's, Burton-on-Trent, which is about 3 hours train ride north from London in the middle of the country, this tradition of fermenting in barrels really got its start, and it became famous worldwide. And And really what happened was brewers were using oak back in those days. That was the medium for making all of the brewing vessels, really. And, whoever it was, I don't know the name of the inventor or if it just came as kind of over time, but brewers were using barrels, and in Burton-on-Trent they figured out fermenting in barrels. And as the technology progressed, these barrels became somewhat harnessed and tied together, and those brewers used a top cropping yeast. So they would start these fermentations in their open fermenters normally, brew, say, a 50-barrel batch of beer. And then after 24 hours of fermentation, when the yeast is at high kreuzen and the fermentation is very strong and protected by the yeast, they would move that fermentation into a series of barrels that were somewhat linked together. The barrels are linked together by swan necks, which allow the fermentation. It'd be the equivalent of your fermentation lock on a carboy. Would allow the fermenting yeast and the blow-off, or whatever would come out of the barrels that were filled with this fermenting wort, would travel up into a trough above the barrels, which was tipped to one angle, allowing the liquid to run to the end and then migrate its way back through tubes to the barrels. So it was somewhat of a recirculating fermentation, but most importantly, a lot of that top cropping yeast would reside or end up in the trough above the barrels, which would allow the brewers to harvest yeast from that trough and move it on to subsequent fermentations. And that system remained the state-of-the-art in fermentation technology in Burton-on-Trent for 100 years. And Bass, I have a picture in my office of kind of circa 1950, 1960s Bass fermentation union still employed, making literally millions of barrels of ale in the middle of the 20th century. So now Bass has moved away from the union, and all the other Burton brewers have, with the exception of Marston. So you can go there and still see the original Burton unions. Now move on to Firestone. We took a look at that system and decided that was going to be a way we could make beers, but we knew we weren't going to be sterile filtering or pasteurizing our product. So we had to kind of do away with the open trough system. We weren't interested in harvesting yeast off of that system per se. We really just wanted to have the effects of the fermentation in the barrel. In Burton-on-Trent, they use predominantly neutral oak. In other words, they'll bring barrels in made from low tannin oaks or oak that isn't going to impart a particularly strong character on their beer, and then use those barrels for an extended period of time until they become essentially a neutral vessel. So they were really interested in the geometry of the barrel and how it had an effect on the fermentation characteristics. And homebrewers out there probably know this as well, or even better than professional brewers, that if you ferment in a small carboy and then try to move up to a larger vessel or a more shallow vessel or a taller vessel, you get different flavors, no doubt. And the brewers in Burton-on-Trent realized that a fermentation in a barrel was this perfect amount of surface area and this perfect environment to get the flavors they wanted out of their yeast. So we tried to take that to the next level and use brand new American oak in our system, and not only get the effects of the geometry of the barrel, but also get the effects of this wonderful flavor of medium to heavy toasted American oak. So if you look at ours, it's really simply just fermenting our beers, primary fermentation, in oak barrels. So we like they do in Burton-on-Trent, spark a primary fermentation in our main stainless fermenters. Then at 24 hours, when that beer is a seething fermentation at high kreuzen, we move that wort to a series of barrels, which is now 42 barrels in our union. And those barrels are essentially wine barrels. They come to us brand new. We ferment the beer in those barrels, and then once the primary fermentation is complete, we push that fermented beer, blend it together in a single stainless steel vessel, and then do the cold stabilization and later filter and blend that beer into our normal double barrel ale production. So you have a long-winded answer.
Well, it's a complicated system, and it deserves a long answer. So you take that beer. You don't bottle up the beer that's been aged in those barrels straight, right?
We have. For our 1000th batch celebration, we bottled some of that just straight up. And I'll be honest with you, it was kind of met with mixed reviews. People who know the brewery well, we actually sell on draft in our tasting rooms 100% fermented in oak double barrel ale, unfiltered. And people love it. It's our best-selling beer in-house. And our regulars understand it and know what it is. When we sold it out in trade, I think a lot of people were expecting for our 1000th batch that we'd be doing some big barley wine or some kind of, outlandish extreme beer, when in fact it's really a very delicate, low alcohol, 5% alcohol, British-style pale ale with oak flavors. So I think a lot of people were kind of perplexed by that. They're like, what? This is their 1000th batch? Tastes like the regular double barrel ale, but it's really fun. You come into our tasting rooms and you can sit there with a glass of 100% oak fermented product and then taste that side by side with our blended product, which is essentially about 20% oak fermented beer and 80% stainless fermented beer, and taste those side by side, and really it showcases what the oak can do to the beer.
So,
we believe you can't make the beer any other way without that oak component fermenting in the barrels.
So in this case, you're using blending to temper and adjust a certain flavor that you've introduced into the beer and kind of give it the balance that you want in the final product.
Absolutely.
Now, other breweries, and you may do the same, use blending to control consistency. And, for example, when we visited Oscar Blues in Lyons, Colorado, they were brewing a batch in the kettle, and then they pointed to the fermenter, which is big enough to hold several batches, and it didn't occur to me until that point that that's the way that they can achieve consistency, because if each batch is off a little bit, it doesn't matter because you're mixing several batches into one fermenter.
Yeah, and again, maybe homebrewers don't think about that as much because you're kind of brewing batch to batch, but in most breweries, and ours included, we have, again, a 50-barrel brew house, but our average fermenter size is 200. We have some 300-barrel fermenters. So, in fact, we just placed an order for some 500-barrel fermenters. So those fermenters will actually receive up to 10 batches out of the brew house. The general rule is you don't really want to build a fermenter more than what you can fill in a 24-hour period. So in our brewing program, we can do up to 10 turns in a single day, for instance.
Wow. So
that's the general rule in brewing. And yeah, brewers really look to that, blending out of the brew house, to gain consistency on the wort. And it's perfect, for instance, if your first couple turns out of the brew house are either low or high in gravity, rather than having to do a lot of water additions or longer boils or things that might affect the flavor of your wort and later your beer. You can make that up or make adjustments on the fly in subsequent brews. So it really does help in the brew house consistency.
Now, for your 10 beer, you really kind of went all out as far as blending is concerned, and you brought in winemakers to help you in that process, right?
Yeah. So Firestone's never been a darling of the beer geeks, and for the reason that we don't produce seasonals, and we produce very few, almost no specialty beers. And it's been kind of the philosophy of the owners to do very few beers very well. And so when I got the opportunity to actually brew a specialty beer and bottle it, the whole project got a little out of hand, actually. It started out with us just saying, well, we'll make a barley wine or a Russian Imperial Stout, and we'll ferment it in the oak union, and then you look around and you're like, well, that's what everybody does, for their specialty beers. And they're like, well, maybe we'll brew a Russian Imperial Stout and a barley wine, ferment them in oak, and age them in oak. Oh, well, that was a good idea. And they're like, well, what about an Imperial Brown Ale? And we kept adding all these beers to the fold, and finally it kind of dawned on us that, we could really have a lot of fun here and make a beer with many components, fermented and aged in oak, and then actually do what a winemaker does at the end of the program, taste through all these things and blend them together, thinking solely not about a style specifically, but flavors that we want to try to develop through blending and make a finished product that way. And we're like, wow, what an idea. And here we are in the middle of wine country here in Paso Robles with all these talented winemakers who are experts and, essentially practice the art of blending on a daily basis. And we thought, well, what a wonderful resource to tap into. Let's give it a try. And it really turned into an educational experience for all of us as brewers. And I think we ended up with a product that ultimately tastes a lot different than it would have a bunch of brewers sat in a room and blended this thing together. And certainly something very much more complex than anything we could have made in a single brew on the brew house.
So how many beers did you wind up blending together for the 10?
Our target was to try to have 10, we got really into the number of 10. We were like 10-year anniversary, 10 components, 10 months aged in bourbon barrels, 10 pallets of beer, We got all into this number, but truth be known, there were, believe, 7 components that made it into the finished product. Now, that being said, disclaimer here, if I was going to redesign a blending project, and I think I said this in my talk in Denver, I probably would start with fewer components. We kept running into the problem, you try to blend too many beers together and you end up with real muddle, kind of muted flavors, and nothing really stands out. And I think winemakers know this as well. What's interesting, though, in the art of winemaking, especially in Europe, all wines were blends. It's more of an American phenomena to have a single grape variety or a single varietal wine. If you go to the Bordeaux region of France or you go into the Rhone Valley, Rhone's the best example probably. Almost 100% of those wines coming out of the Rhone Valley in France are blends. And you look at the label and it isn't varietal specific. So, move that over to brewing history in England, in the porter age, those were all blended beers as well. Brewers were practicing the party guile method of brewing. They would age some beers and blend them with young beers. And really, in the end, it was the brewmaster's art of trying to create consistency and complexity in his finished product and set the product apart from other beers. We kind of lost that in brewing somewhere along the lines, and you go to SIPO or you go into the brewing schools, they don't talk about this too much. When they talk about blending, they talk about high gravity brewing and blending water in to make different products, but they don't talk a lot about blending different beers together.
Well, it's certainly less efficient, or at least it sounds less efficient and less industrial to have that aesthetic component in there of actually bringing in human taste buds to blend a product year after year. I mean, we've talked to Lauren and Eric Salazar at New Belgium, and they're responsible for blending La Folie, and there they have these giant foeders with different levels of funkiness, I guess, in each of these beers, and it's their job to make the blend every year. So I guess you would see in the industrialization of beer that would kind of go away.
Well, when I was doing some research for this talk on blending, because we weren't really purposely looking back at history or trying to apply Belgian brewing techniques to our program. This was something that came really from our exposure to the wine industry. But you look back in history and back to the porter brewers of, over a century ago, it was very common for them to have vessels in their brewery very similar to New Belgium's foeders and have soured porter beer waiting in the wings up to a year, 2 years old, that they would blend at smaller amounts into their young beer to give it drinkability. Because, we know the acidic character of those Belgian beers or of some of those porters really brings this nice drinkability to the finished product when blended properly. When consumed at full strength, it's like salad dressing in your mouth. It's just too acidic. But and winemakers talk about that all the time. They talk about acid and the levels of acidity in their wines and how that makes some wines more food friendly. It makes more wines more drinkable. I think in the end, I think there's a lot to be learned from these other industries like winemaking that can be applied to brewing. And, that was just kind of the concept here, is to look outside of, our brewing blinders and try to grab onto something that could create something fun in our beers.
410, you had a strong English-style barley wine, an imperial oatmeal stout, a double IPA, or an American barley wine, I guess, depending on who you talk to, the Ruby. And by the way, I've tried that. Mark Smith brought over a bottle of that when we celebrated our 100th episode.
Nice.
And that was a very, very tasty beer. An imperial brown ale, an oak-fermented robust porter, American brown ale with hemp seeds, and flagship English, your oak-fermented double barrel ale, which is your flagship English pale ale, 100% oak-fermented. And in the end, what you wound up with was a blend that was almost half of the what's called the Abacus, the strong English-style barley wine. Did it surprise you that you would have to rely so heavily on one beer to be the base?
Well, we didn't know what we were going to get into, but I kind of learned this from the winemakers, again, that most of the time, again, disclaimer, I think every time you do one of these projects, it could probably end up being a little bit different, but most of the time, it makes sense to pick a single component to be the foundational kind of backbone piece, and you're using the other beers, in this case, or other components, to try to blend in complexity. And again, when we were doing even blends or getting too many beers in the blend, we'd end up with these real muddled characters. You can kind of imagine it. But if we took a single component and then, we were doing this with graduated cylinders and glasses at a table. I mean, it's not any kind of mad science other than, it's just playing around with beers. And at 10% blends, 5% blends, Russian Imperial Stout would add this amazing, touch of roastiness or coffee flavor to a beer that was already pretty good. And then you take another product, say maybe a hoppy beer, and just lay that in there at 5 or 10% again. And you don't necessarily perceive this strong hop character, but you perceive some roundness and flavor, or you may pick up a little bit of that fruity edge from the hop. It was really interesting to do it. What I was saying at the talk is I would really recommend to those who are interested in playing around with blending is to go out and buy some, commercial examples. Pick up a sour beer, pick up a couple barley wines, pick up a Russian Imperial Stout, and try some of this at home just with some, finished commercial examples. And you can kind of get an idea for the direction you might want to go before you start brewing beers and blending beers together.
Yeah, you talk about in your presentation your kind of blending toolkit, of the beers that you would want to have in your cellar to kind of play with. And what beers? You guys make beers that by blending existing beers that you have. For instance, you list a Walker's Shadow Black Lager, which is 90% Firestone Lager and 10% Firestone Reserve, which is a robust porter. So, that's another example of how you're using blending commercially to make a third beer that you can make on a smaller run out of two more larger run beers. So give us some advice, as home brewers of the beers that would be, kind of versatile to keep on hand.
Mm-hmm. Well, of course, it's really limitless. We've had some really interesting results taking our hoppy beers and blending in some of our malty beers. So more so, I would take a step back and look at it kind of your flavor palette, so to speak. If you're painting on some canvas, for instance, what to your palate would be a good background? And to us, we tend to kind of start with the base malt flavors, so our hemp ale, which is an American brown ale, seems to be this perfect kind of stabilizing blend beer. It's already very drinkable. it has some sweetness and some malty background, and it's fun to, say, layer a hoppy beer into that beer to give you some new flavor characteristics. So that's just one example, but what we're finding in for our strong beer blends, the barley wine really seems to be a nice kind of foundational piece. And in our experience anyway, when we get to aging beers in barrels, it seems like the beers that have a lower aromatic hop profile tend to hold up better in the barrels. In other words, can take some age without getting a lot of those kind of ribey, dry fruit and off-oxidized characteristics that hop oils tend to give you, even rancid hop notes after a while, and layer in other things into them. And I'm really keen on the concept of having an acidic beer or a sour beer also as a piece that's going to end up being pretty important in the blend, being able to add acid essentially to that blend and pick it up a bit with the acid. And then it seems like having some stout on hand or something that's got a real roasty component is also really important. I mean, it's such a profound flavor, and it can have such an effect at low levels. It also helps you adjust color as well. So, again, you kind of think of like you're painting a picture, put 3 or 4 different colors on there that are, complementary, and you can come up with some really good flavors in the end.
Now, continuing that painting reference, I'm not an artist myself, but whenever I would play with paints, I'd always wind up with brown or some dark muddled color. Is it easy when you're blending to get muddled in the first of all the color of the beer and the flavor as well? I mean, is it easy to lose the kind of brightness and get into
absolutely.
Those lower
and I think that's where the winemakers really came in and taught us something, because the brewers really tended towards aggressive flavors and aggressive blends, and it inevitably ended up, in our experience, at least on this project, with real muddled characteristics. Brewers by nature are just addicted to hops and hop heads, so they're always trying to put more of the hoppy beer in. More is better, and that certainly wasn't the case. And a winemaker's palate is tuned completely different. And at least in this, in this experiment, we learned that winemakers were really more in tune with subtle notes and subtle flavors, and really kind of leaned towards malt characteristics and trying to find fruit characteristics. Even though there was no fruit in any of these beers, we were able to blend just a little bit of Russian Imperial Stout into a barley wine, and we get this cherry note coming out. It was really amazing. It was like you were actually creating something that wasn't there. And from a chemistry standpoint, I couldn't begin to really explain it to you. I'd have to look it up. But somehow we were able to come up with subtleties that really had a profound impact on the end product.
So maybe the first place to start is just taking 2 of your existing beers, or like you said, some commercial examples, and just start mixing them together in a glass.
Yeah, and I would, just as a starting point, I would always start with maybe 90% of one beer and blend, 10% of another in there, and just try it and see which direction it takes you, and then take it up to, say, 15% and see if it's going the direction you want. And if you're using a 100 mil graduated cylinder, or you could probably even cut that down to 50 mils, you can get quite a few blends out of a couple bottles of beer and get some real idea which direction you're going. And here's an important note: is the other important tool in all this is a notepad and a piece of a pencil, and because after a couple hours of blending, you're so soused you can't remember what you did the next day.
You're blended yourself.
We had a couple sessions where like, what was that? Oh, you didn't write it down, damn it! And we got to start over and go searching for those flavors again.
And I would imagine that your palate fatigue would come into play there as well. And if you take notes, and you can come back and start fresh at the other end of the notepad and see if your impressions were correct.
Yeah. On one of our real big blending days when we were getting down to the wire and we needed to complete the project, we actually had, I think, 3 shifts of winemakers come in. so I started out with a couple guys that I really appreciated their wine and what they've been doing, and really was looking for their ideas. And my palate was shot halfway through the session, so then I was kind of using other people's palates to try to get to the end.
It's tough work, but somebody has to do it.
Yeah. I know another disclaimer is to make sure you have a driver after you're done.
Oh.
If you're not at home.
Most definitely. So you list a bunch of homebrewing ideas on creating a blending cellar. What are some technical things that we can think about in order to work our way toward blending as a practice in our own homebrewing setups?
Well, I mean, you're just, as far as equipment or technical know-how?
Yeah, for instance, you say get into the party guile method.
Yeah, I mean, I think when I've talked to homebrewers, a lot of it's, I only make 5 gallons, and how am I going to fill a barrel, or how am I going to make enough beers to blend so they're all ready at the right time? So, I think a lot of this could be something that clubs do. Get a group of brewers together and make a bunch of beers, talk about it in advance, and try to pick styles that are complementary with the idea that you're going to come back later and blend them together. The party guile, I love that concept of running off heavy worts and then fermenting that separate from the second worts and creating 2 beers out of a single mash, and then maybe coming back, blending them together. Or simply making a beer and separating it into 2 fermenters and just treat it differently, pre or post fermentation. Maybe ferment part of that beer with some fruit, part of it dry hop, and then maybe bring those beers back together and see if you can't create some interesting flavors that way. I mean, really, the bottom line, it comes down to creativity and trying to just think outside of the box and create some flavors that you wouldn't normally do in your normal everyday brewing practices.
We did a party guile brew and wound up with this rich, delicious, hoppy, probably double IPA, and then this weak, low alcohol, second beer that wasn't nearly as interesting as the first one. And I wish I had thought at the time to, blend some of the two to kind of come up with something somewhere along the middle of those two.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think in English tradition, when they would perform party guile, they would sell that small beer at a drastically reduced rate, and they would sell the first wort produced beer as their extra special bitter, and then they could make other beers at different price points and different alcohol levels that were blends of those two. And that was very common. And of course, as a commodity, it was sold based on its alcohol percentage and taxed according to its alcohol percentage. So it also gave the brewer some, different price points, which, ultimately at the end of the day, as a professional brewer, you got to sell what you make. And so they were kind of thinking in those terms.
Well, what's next? What's the next big project? I mean, you've got some expectations to fill. So what's next?
Gosh. Well, we the timing's right for this talk, actually, because we just on Friday brewed every one of these beers, and you mentioned a bunch of the names, gets an inside code name, and we haven't released very many of the single components. But currently in barrel we have Parabola, which is a Russian Imperial Stout that turned out to be almost, it's like 14 or 15% alcohol, and it's sitting in bourbon barrels and has been for over a year now in our cellar.
Oh, boy.
We've got kind of my pride and joy right now is a beer called Bravo. It's actually named after the single hop variety that we used in it. Bravo is a new variety that Steiner came out in the last year commercially. It's pretty high alpha, but we utilized it not to try to showcase the hop so much. The beer is Imperial Brown Ale, and we really were trying to create beers that would really complement the barrel flavors. So that Imperial Brown Ale really tastes good. It's coming out of the barrels with loads of vanilla and kind of coconut flavors from the wood, and I'm really excited about that. And I have a feeling that beer is going to end up being the centerpiece of the new blend. Although on Friday we just brewed Rufus. a.k.a. Roofie. And that's a 22 plate, or about a 10% alcohol beer, very red in color. We used some dark candy sugar, Belgian liquid dark candy sugar in it. So it's basically just a base of English, actually Muttons, pale ale malt, and this dark Belgian candy sugar, fermented with our British ale strain, and hopped predominantly with Styrian Golding and Saaz, trying to keep the hop profile real mellow. And we used pretty high mashing temperatures, trying to create a beer that would be a little more round or malty in its finished stage, a little more sweet. And because everything we have in barrel currently is very hot and dry, and we're hoping that Rufus gives us the ability to bring some sweetness and some complexity from those Belgian sugars, and so those are the three primary components I'm looking at using in the next blend. Like I was saying earlier, I'd love to have a sour component to play with. I fear bringing Brettanomyces into this brewery like nothing else, so I may have to call on some of my sour beer brewing friends in the industry to give me that. Maybe Lauren and Eric would be willing to lend me a little bit out of their program for that. But in any case, that's what we're looking at, and that's all the further it's gone. I think we learned a lot from the first program, so I expect the next beer to be really good as well. I think we also learned that we're going to have to be a little careful when we sell the thing, because we released 10 and put no limits on sales, and it disappeared like in a week or two out of the brewery. And the rest that we held back behind was somehow disappeared from the brewery as well. So I don't have a lot of 10 to compare to the new product, but
well, I've got a bottle in my basement, so if you run out, maybe I could negotiate.
Well, and the barrels for Roofie for that component, because this is going to be a 100% oak aged product, show up in the brewery this week, and they're all 16-year-old Heaven Hill bourbon barrels that were just dumped last week.
Oh man!
So there'll no doubt be a bourbon component in this product again. So
interesting to say the least, and I would say incredible. Well, I appreciate your time, Matt, and I appreciate your talents, and I wish that you guys distributed in Northwest Arkansas. But
one day.
I bet everybody says that, though. Well, thank you, sir, very much for your time.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Well, thanks again to Matt Brynildson of Firestone Walker. If you want to download Matt's PowerPoint presentation on blending, you can find it on the Firestone Walker homepage. And I'll put a link to it in the description of this episode on basicbrewingradio.com. If you have brewing questions, show suggestions, or just want to say howdy, write to james@basicbrewing.com, or just fill out the contact form on basicbrewing.com. And please don't forget to tell us where you're from. And while you're on our site, you can check out our online shop, where you can find great pricing on our DVDs and a combo deal to save you even more. In our first DVD, Basic Brewing, Introduction to Extract Home Brewing, we walk you through the extract brewing process step by step from boiling to bottling. And in Basic Brewing, Stepping into All Grain, we take you through the all grain process from milling your grain to collecting your wort. And we are starting production on our third DVD. Just a little teaser there. You can see a listing of the fine folks across the country who sell our DVDs on basicbrewing.com. And if there isn't a vendor in your area, you can order it online. Remember our shirts and hats, including our ever-popular Go Forth and Flocculate shirt. And thanks to everybody who's continued to click on our Amazon.com link. And I just realized I didn't look this week to see to pick out some fun stuff to mention on the Amazon thing. I know. Let's see. I can remember a copy of iWork from Apple, and then I also remember a copy of Microsoft Office for Mac. So a little bit from Apple, a little bit from Microsoft. We try not to take sides here at Basic Brewing Radio, except on the side of good beer. It's late in the day. Tired. Thanks again, everybody. Remember, I can't tell who bought what on the Amazon thing, so no worries. Just click on the Amazon.com logo on our site the next time you feel like Amazon shopping. We appreciate the support there. That's all until next week. Until then, thanks for listening. I'm James Spencer. Production help for Basic Brewing Radio and our website is provided by our buddy in Austin, Kelly Dodson, who also designed our logo. Basic Brewing Radio is a production of Active Voicing. We'll talk to you next time, everybody. So long. Happy brewing. Happy trails.